He built a paradise of musk and gold to mock the afterlife, but when he reached its gate Al-Malik swallowed the sky and the rivers of wine, milk, and honey curdled into a choking mire around his last, dying dream. Long before the maps of the modern world were drawn, in an age when the desert was a living, breathing beast that swallowed armies whole, there walked a man who did not just desire a kingdom, but sought to strangle the very heavens to claim a throne that did not belong to him. In the scorching heart of the peninsula, among the people of Ad, rose Shaddad the son of Ad, a tyrant of such colossal arrogance that the earth itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of his footsteps. He was not merely a king, he was a force of natural disaster, a conqueror who had drowned the world in blood until there was no neck left that did not bow to his command and no voice that dared to whisper defiance against his rule. But for a soul as cavernous and starving as Shaddad's, earthly dominion was not enough, for he was tormented by a jealousy that burned hotter than the noon sun, a jealousy directed not at men, but at the unseen, at the promise of the next life that the prophet spoke of with such reverence. He heard the descriptions of paradise, of rivers flowing with milk and honey, of palaces constructed from hollowed pearls, of dust made of pure musk, and of eternal life where no pain exists. Where others felt hope, Shaddad felt a cold, reptilian fury. He looked at his vast empire, drenched in the sweat of slaves and the blood of enemies, and he decided in that moment of supreme blasphemy that he would not wait for death to see paradise, nor would he bow to any other sovereign to enter it. He would drag heaven down to the earth, chain it to the dunes, and declare himself the master of eternal bliss, challenging the very name of Al-Malik, the true king. He summoned the architects, the sorcerers of stone, and the generals of his armies to the foot of his throne, his voice rumbling like the grinding of tectonic plates as he issued a decree that would bankrupt the world. He commanded them to build Iram of the Pillars, a city unlike any that had ever been created since the dawn of time, a city that would make the sun jealous and the moon weep with envy. Go forth, he roared, his eyes gleaming with a madness that looked like wisdom to the fearful, and strip the earth of its skin. The order went out to every corner of the known world, to the mines of the deep south and the riverbeds of the far north. For 300 years, the world was held hostage by his vanity. Every gold nugget, every vein of silver, every chrysolite, every pearl hidden in the depths of the ocean was seized. Mothers were robbed of their heirlooms, temples were stripped of their altars, and kings were left with nothing but iron, for all the beauty of the world was being funneled into the empty quarter. It was a mobilization of resources so absolute that history says the mines of the world ran dry, and for a generation, no gold was seen in the markets of the east or west because it was all flowing into the burning sands to feed the hunger of one man. Shaddad did not care for the piles of bones that accumulated in the foundations, nor for the thousands of laborers who collapsed, their lungs filled with the dust of the desert, their bodies broken by the weight of silver bricks. He demanded that the walls be built not of stone, but of alternating bricks of gold and silver, cemented together not with mud, but with the rarest musk to ensure that the very air of the city smelled of sanctity. He ordered rivers to be dug under the palaces, channeling water, milk, wine, and honey through pipes of crystal, mimicking the promises of the divine scriptures with a mocking precision. It was a project of supreme defiance, a physical manifestation of the human ego trying to wrestle the crown from the divine. As the walls of Iram rose higher, piercing the cloudless sky with their jewel-encrusted spires, a terrifying silence began to settle over the desert, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable hammer to fall. Shaddad sat in his temporary palace, aging but undying, preserved by his own spite, waiting for the news that his heaven was ready, completely unaware that he was building nothing but a golden tomb, and that the true king, Al-Malik, was watching every brick being laid with a patience that was far more terrifying than any immediate wrath. 300 years passed like the slow, grinding turn of a millstone, grinding the bones of the earth into dust to feed the insatiable hunger of the construction, and during this time, Shaddad did not die, for his life was unnaturally prolonged by the sheer intensity of his defiance, suspended in a state of withered anticipation like a spider waiting in the center of a web that spanned the entire world. Then came the day, a day scorched by a sun that seemed to burn with a peculiar, angry brightness, when the messengers arrived from the depths of the empty quarter, their skin leathered by the wind and their eyes wide with the trauma of witnessing something that human eyes were never meant to behold. They fell before the throne of Shaddad, not in reverence, but in the exhaustion of men who had seen the boundaries of reality shattered, and they whispered the words that the tyrant had waited centuries to hear: "It is finished." The city of Iram did not merely exist, it dominated the horizon of the wasteland, a terrifying miracle of architecture where not a single stone from the mountains had been used. The messengers described a fortress where the bricks alternated between red gold and white silver, creating a dizzying, hypnotic pattern that pulsed under the desert heat like the scales of a living dragon. They spoke of high palaces that scraped the belly of the sky, their balconies suspended over gardens that mocked the laws of nature, for in these gardens, the trees were not grown from seeds and soil, but were forged from gold and silver, their trunks solid metal, their branches spreading out in rigid, eternal perfection. The leaves were plates of emerald and chrysolite that chimed softly in the hot wind, a metallic melody devoid of life, and the fruits that hung from these boughs were clusters of pearls, rubies, and topazes, heavy, cold, and inedible, a feast for the eyes but a famine for the soul. Shaddad rose from his throne, the creaking of his joints drowned out by the roar of triumph that erupted from his throat, a sound that carried the weight of 3 centuries of obsession. He did not thank the workers, nor did he offer gratitude to the earth that had yielded its treasures. Instead, he ordered the immediate mobilization of his entire court, a migration of such magnitude that it would leave his old capital a ghost town within a single day. He gathered 1,000 squadrons of his elite guards, men clad in armor so polished it blinded the onlooker, and he summoned his wives, his concubines, his ministers, and his slaves, a sea of humanity destined to populate his manufactured heaven. They prepared the camels, thousands upon thousands of them, laden with the finest silks and carpets to lay upon the floors of Iram, for Shaddad had decreed that no foot should touch the bare ground of his paradise. As the colossal caravan began to move, winding its way out of the city like a glittering serpent of steel and flesh, the very air seemed to thicken, heavy with a static charge that raised the hair on the arms of the superstitious. The horses were skittish, their eyes rolling in their sockets as if they could sense the looming precipice, the invisible line they were about to cross between the dominion of man and the forbidden territory of the divine. Shaddad rode at the head, not on a beast, but in a palanquin carried by 40 strong men, shielded from the sun by curtains of spun gold, his mind already walking the halls of Iram, already tasting the sweet water that flowed through the canals of onyx and pearl. But miles ahead, in the heart of the deep desert, the city of Iram stood in absolute, terrifying silence, a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the silver streets. There was no bird song, for no bird would nest in a tree of cold metal, there was no hum of insects, for there was no life to sustain them, there was only the hollow whistle of the wind passing through the jeweled arches, a sound like the mourning of lost souls. The ground of the city was not sand, but saffron and musk, a thick, cloying perfume that saturated the air, intended to mimic the scent of the celestial gardens but instead smelling of something preserved, something dead and embalmed. The riverbeds, lined with jacinth, ran with clear water and wine, but the flow was too regular, too perfect, lacking the chaotic beauty of a natural stream, moving with the mechanical precision of a clock. It was a masterpiece of idolatry, a cage built of diamonds, waiting for its bird. As Shaddad's caravan drew closer, cutting through the dunes day after day, the anticipation grew into a fever. He could feel the pulse of the city calling to him, a siren song of ultimate power. He did not know that the city was indeed waiting for him, but not to crown him as a god, it was waiting as a trap waits for the wolf, gleaming and open. The atmosphere around the caravan grew darker, the sun taking on a bruised, reddish hue, and the wind began to die down completely, stripping the world of sound until the only noise was the rhythmic thud of feet and hooves marching toward their doom. Shaddad, blinded by the glitter of his own ego, pushed them harder, his heart beating with the frantic rhythm of a thief who believes he has successfully stolen the sunrise, unaware that the true owner of the dawn, Malik, had merely allowed him to build his own execution block with the finest jewels of the earth. The horizon begins to bleed, a shimmering distortion of heat and light that defies the natural laws of the desert, for as the massive caravan of Shaddad approaches the destination, the sun seems to lose its dominance in the sky, challenged by a reflection so blinding, so violently brilliant, that the riders are forced to shield their eyes with thick layers of silk. It is not a mirage, it is an abomination of solid matter, a structure that screams against the beige emptiness of the Rub al-Khali, rising from the sands like a golden wound inflicted upon the earth. Slowly, painfully slowly, the vague shimmer solidifies into the terrifying reality of Iram, and a collective gasp, a sound of raw, primal shock, ripples through the throats of 200,000 people. The city does not look like a place for human habitation, it looks like a celestial object that has crashed and refused to break, a fortress of such impossible geometry that the mind struggles to comprehend its scale. The walls are not merely high, they are mountainous, stretching 300 cubits into the burning air, a seamless, vertical ocean of alternating bricks, one of red gold, one of white silver, stacked with a precision that suggests no human hand ever touched them. Between the bricks, where the mortar should be, there is no gray mud, no crumbling clay, but a thick, dark paste of ambergris and musk that sweats in the heat, releasing a fragrance so overpowering, so heavy and sweet, that it begins to choke the lungs of the approaching army, replacing the clean, dry scent of the desert with the cloying, suffocating smell of an open grave filled with flowers. Shaddad, peering through the gold mesh curtains of his palanquin, feels a surge of adrenaline that feels less like joy and more like madness, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird as he beholds the manifestation of his own ego. He sees the towers, 1,000 of them, piercing the atmosphere, each one topped with a spire of ruby that catches the sun and scatters blood-red beams of light across the dunes, turning the white sands to the color of slaughter. This is his answer to the prophets, this is his rebuttal to the warnings of the unseen. He has built the impossible, he has dragged the promised paradise down from the heavens and chained it to the earth, and in doing so, he believes he has conquered the need for God. But as the caravan draws closer, the animals begin to react to a presence that the humans are too blinded by greed to notice. 10,000 camels simultaneously balk, digging their padded feet into the sand, groaning with a deep, guttural terror that vibrates through the ground, their eyes rolling back in their heads as they refuse to take another step toward the golden gates. The horses, magnificent beasts bred for war and fearless in battle, begin to foam at the mouth, trembling violently, their instincts screaming that the city ahead is not a sanctuary but a predator, a gaping maw waiting to swallow them whole. The whips of the drivers crack through the stagnant air, tearing flesh, forcing the terrified beasts to move forward against their will, dragging the entire procession into the shadow of the walls which seems to drop the temperature by 20 degrees in a single second. They reach the outer perimeter, and the silence of Iram hits them like a physical blow, a silence so absolute that the sound of a dropped coin would echo like a thunderclap. There is no wind here, the air is dead, stagnant, motionless, as if the atmosphere itself is afraid to circulate through these cursed streets. Through the colossal main gate, which stands open and unguarded, the soldiers can see into the heart of the city, and the sight freezes the blood in their veins. They see the rivers, exactly as Shaddad had commanded, channels cut from solid onyx and lined with pearls, flowing with liquids that look like water, milk, wine, and clarified honey, but the flow is disturbingly smooth, without a ripple, without a splash, moving with the eerie consistency of oil. They see the trees, the forests of fabrication, where trunks of gold support leaves of emerald and fruit of topaz, creating a canopy of jewels that casts a prismatic, disjointed shadow on the streets below. It is a scene of breathtaking beauty, yet it is utterly repulsive, a sterile, cold imitation of life that lacks the warmth of creation, a place where nothing grows, nothing changes, and nothing dies. It is a museum of vanity, perfect and hollow. Shaddad commands his palanquin to be lowered, and for the first time in months, his feet touch the sand, but his eyes never leave the open gate. He calls for his favorite horse, a black stallion that is now shivering uncontrollably, its coat slick with the sweat of pure panic. Shaddad mounts the beast, his grip on the reins iron tight, forcing the animal into submission, and he rides to the front of the column, positioning himself as the first soul to enter the paradise he forced the earth to vomit up. He pauses there, at the threshold, the massive archway looming over him, inscribed not with the names of the divine, but with his own titles, a list of arrogance carved in diamond. He looks back at his army, at the millions of eyes watching him, and he raises a hand, soaking in the adoration, soaking in the fear, believing that he has finally become Al-Malik, the king of the world, the owner of destiny. He can taste the victory, it tastes like musk and metal. He turns his face back to the city, to the dark, inviting coolness of the jeweled streets, and prepares to take the single step that separates the mortal world from his fabricated eternity. He does not know that the air above him is already splitting, that the atoms of the atmosphere are being torn apart by a command descending from the seventh heaven. He does not know that the silence of the desert is not respect, but the holding of breath before a scream. He lifts his foot from the stirrup, intending to step down onto the saffron-dusted road of Iram, and in that split second, suspended between the earth he scorched and the heaven he stole, the universe pauses, waiting for the gavel of the true king to shatter the illusion forever. That single second, the infinitesimal moment between the lifting of a foot and the placing of it upon the ground, stretched out into an eternity of suspended time, a frozen heartbeat where the arrogance of a man hung precariously against the patience of the divine. Shaddad son of Ad, the tyrant who had bled the veins of the earth dry to build his golden cage, hovered there with his boot poised above the saffron-dusted pavement, his eyes fixed on the glittering darkness of the jeweled hallway that lay ahead, a hallway he believed led to eternal bliss but which in truth led only to the gaping maw of oblivion. The silence that had blanketed the desert was suddenly, violently violated not by a sound from the earth, but by a shift in the very crushing weight of the atmosphere, a drop in pressure so sudden and so severe that the ears of every soldier, slave, and beast in the convoy popped with a wet, sickening crack. The sun, which had been beating down with the fury of a hammer, did not set, nor was it covered by the clouds of rain or storm, rather, it was extinguished, blotted out by a sudden, rolling darkness that descended from the zenith like a curtain of heavy velvet, a darkness that was not merely the absence of light but the presence of a terrified void. The air turned instantly from the blistering heat of the kiln to a cold so profound, so biting and alien, that it froze the sweat on the skin of the horses into sheets of instant ice, and the golden palm trees inside the city began to vibrate, their emerald leaves chattering against each other with a sound like the grinding of a million broken teeth. And then, from the center of that unnatural darkness, from a place beyond the visible sky, came the sound. It was not thunder, for thunder is the clumsiness of clouds bumping in the dark, it was not the roar of a lion, for a lion is merely a beast of flesh and blood. This was the sayha, the cry, a sonic laceration of the fabric of reality, a single, sustained note of such horrifying purity and volume that it did not enter the ear but bypassed the flesh entirely to strike directly at the terrified rhythm of the human heart. It began as a hum, a low frequency that rattled the bones inside the flesh, shaking the marrow, causing the teeth to ache and the vision to blur, and within the span of a single breath, it escalated into a scream that shattered the sanity of every living thing for 100 miles. The horses, those magnificent creatures of war draped in gold and silk, did not rear or run, they simply ceased to function, their brains liquefied by the pressure of the noise, dropping dead in their tracks with their eyes wide open, staring at a horror that no biological mind could process. The soldiers, the elite guard of Shaddad who had slaughtered nations without blinking, clutched at their heads, their fingers digging into their scalps as if trying to tear out the organ that was registering this divine frequency, but there was no escape, for the sound was inside them, a resonance of judgment that vibrated in every cell, every vein, every nerve ending. Shaddad, the man who had declared himself the rival of the Almighty, remained frozen in his posture of entry, his foot still hovering, never to touch the ground of his beloved city. The scream from the heavens hit him with the force of a collapsing star, stripping away the layers of his arrogance like dry skin peeling from a burn. In that fraction of a second, the crown upon his head, heavy with the stolen jewels of conquered kings, felt like a circle of molten lead, and the silk robes that adorned his body felt like a shroud of iron. He tried to speak, tried to roar a command, tried to invoke his own name as a talisman against the wrath of the skies, but his voice was swallowed, erased, annihilated by the overwhelming majesty of the true king, Al-Malik, whose dominion he had foolishly tried to usurp. He watched, helpless and paralyzed, as the magnificent city of Iram began to unmake itself before his dying eyes. The sound waves were so intense that they acted as a physical hammer against the architecture. The alternating bricks of gold and silver, which had been stacked with such geometric perfection, began to weep. The metal lost its cohesion, vibrating until the molecular bonds shattered, and the walls did not crumble like stone but dissolved, running down like wax in a furnace, a glittering sludge of precious metal flowing into the streets, burying the musk and the saffron under a tidal wave of molten greed. The great pillars, those towering monuments to human vanity that gave the city its name, groaned with the sound of a dying leviathan before snapping in half, not from the wind, but from the sheer weight of the command that had been issued against them. Huge shards of jasper and onyx, the size of houses, rained down from the sky, crashing into the artificial rivers of wine and honey, splashing the sweet nectar of corruption onto the dying retinue outside the gates. The trees of gold and emerald were uprooted by invisible hands, twisted into knots of scrap metal as if they were made of soft clay, their jeweled fruits shattering into dust that sparkled in the sudden, terrifying gloom. It was a deconstruction of absolute precision. The city was being erased, taken apart piece by piece, atom by atom, by the very forces of nature that Shaddad had claimed to master. The fear that gripped the hearts of the multitude was not the fear of death, for death would have been a mercy. It was the fear of total, existential insignificance, the realization that they were nothing but dust motes standing in the path of a hurricane, that their wealth, their power, and their king were less than shadows against the blinding light of the truth. As the sonic blast reached its crescendo, a wind began to howl, the sarsar, a furious, freezing gale that moved with the intelligence of a hunter. It did not blow aimlessly, it targeted. It ripped the tents from their moorings, it stripped the armor from the soldiers, and it picked up the bodies of the dead and the dying, lifting them into the air like dry leaves in an autumn storm. The sand of the empty quarter, which had laid dormant for centuries, woke up with a vengeance, rising in walls of grit and stone that were 1,000 feet high, swirling around the convoy in a tightening noose of suffocation. Shaddad, still mounted on his dead horse, still suspended in that agonizing moment of almost triumph, felt his heart rupture within his chest. It was not a quiet stopping of the pulse, it was a violent explosion of the organ, unable to sustain the rhythm of life in the presence of such overwhelming wrath. His eyes, wide with the ultimate realization of his folly, saw the gates of Iram crumple like paper, the archway inscribed with his name twisting and melting until the words were illegible, erased from history just as his soul was being erased from the mercy of the Creator. He died without ever setting foot in his paradise, his body stiffening instantly into a statue of rigor mortis, a grotesque monument to the man who almost touched the stars but was dragged down by the gravity of his own sin. The destruction continued for 7 nights and 8 days, a relentless, churning grinder of wind and sound that ensured nothing would remain. The gold turned to dust, the silver turned to grey ash, and the bodies of the people of Ad were tossed around the wasteland like hollow palm stumps, stripped of their flesh, stripped of their dignity, left as empty husks to be buried by the shifting dunes. The musk that had cemented the walls was replaced by the smell of ozone and ancient dust, the sweet rivers were choked with sand, and the light of the jewels was extinguished forever. There was no battle, no resistance, no negotiation, there was only the command and the execution. The city of Iram, which had taken 300 years to build, which had consumed the wealth of the entire world, was dismantled in moments, swallowed by the earth that had been forced to bear its weight. The terrifying efficiency of the destruction served as a grim testament to the attribute of Al-Qahar, the subduer, the one who dominates all and cannot be dominated. When the wind finally died down, and the sun timidly returned to the sky, looking pale and washed out, there was nothing left. No towers, no walls, no armies, no king. Just the endless, rolling waves of the Rub al-Khali, smooth and unbroken, hiding beneath them the wreckage of the greatest lie ever told. The silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of a graveyard, a heavy, permanent seal placed over the lips of the desert, guarding the secret of the city that tried to steal the throne of God and found only the crushing weight of his justice. For 7 nights and 8 days, the sun did not shine upon the quarter of emptiness, for the sky had been sealed by a ceiling of churning, bruised clouds that rotated with the slow, terrifying deliberation of a millstone grinding wheat into flour, but in this case, the wheat was the pride of man and the flour was the dust of history. The wind known as the Sarsar, a freezing, howling gale sent from the reserves of divine wrath, did not merely blow across the surface of the desert, it scoured it, acting like a colossal rasp of sandpaper dragged back and forth over the face of the earth to erase a mistake that had been drawn in ink of gold and blood. It was a wind of such supernatural cold that it cracked the rocks and shattered the molecular bonds of the iron weaponry lying useless in the sand, turning swords into brittle shards of rust within hours. This was not a storm of chaos, it was a storm of order, a systematic, methodical cleanup operation orchestrated by the command of Al-Malik, the sovereign who tolerates no rivals in his dominion. The noise was a constant, deafening drone, a frequency that vibrated the very teeth in the skulls of the dead, a sound that would have driven the living to madness had any been left to hear it, but there were no ears left to listen, only the silent, staring eyes of corpses that were being slowly, inexorably buried under the weight of the judgment they had provoked. The magnificent city of Iram, the Iram of the Pillars, which had stood for a brief, stolen moment as the pinnacle of human achievement, was now being subjected to a humiliation of physics, a reversal of creation where the complex was returned to the simple, and the formed was returned to the formless. The walls of alternating gold and silver, which Shaddad had commanded to be built to mimic the architecture of paradise, were not allowed to simply collapse, they were devoured. The wind, carrying billions of tons of sharp, silica sand, acted as a sandblaster of infinite power, stripping the sheen from the metal, pitting the smooth surfaces, and eroding the intricate carvings of lions and eagles until they were nothing but vague, melted lumps of bullion. The mortar of musk and ambergris, which had been mixed to sweeten the air, was dried out, pulverized, and blown away into the upper atmosphere, leaving behind only the sterile, metallic tang of ozone and the dry, ancient smell of pulverized rock. The jewels that had studded the towers, the fist-sized rubies, the emeralds cut to resemble leaves, the pearls that had been dredged from the deepest oceans at the cost of human lives, were ripped from their settings not by thieves, but by the fingers of the gale, scattered across the wasteland like worthless seeds, buried deep in the shifting dunes where they would remain unseen by human eyes for 10,000 years, returning to the darkness of the earth from which they had been violently torn. As the days of the storm dragged on, the geography of the land began to change, for the desert is not a solid floor but a fluid ocean of particles, and under the influence of the Sarsar, it behaved like a sea in the grip of a typhoon. The ground beneath the city began to liquefy, a phenomenon known as soil liquefaction induced by the relentless vibration of the sonic scream and the weight of the wind. The foundations of Iram, dug deep and reinforced with granite, began to sink, not suddenly, but with a sickening, slurping finality, as if the earth opened its mouth to swallow the abomination whole. The great pillars, those towering monuments to ego that had scraped the sky, tilted and slid downward, inch by inch, disappearing into the churning quicksand of the Rub al-Khali. They did not fall over to remain as ruins for future generations to marvel at, they were inhaled by the crust of the planet, dragged down into the suffocating dark, ensuring that no trace would remain to testify to the grandeur of the tyrant. It was a burial of absolute negation. The rivers of wine and honey that had flowed through the canals of onyx were choked with grit, the liquids turning into a thick, abrasive sludge that hardened into concrete, sealing the plumbing of the false paradise forever. The trees of gold were twisted into unrecognizable knots of scrap metal and then pulled under the surface, drowning in the dry ocean, their jeweled leaves crushed into dust. And then there was the army, the 200,000 souls who had marched with Shaddad, the men who had believed themselves invincible, the women who had adorned themselves for a life of eternal pleasure, the servants who had carried the burdens of the king. They lay where they had fallen, scattered across the plain like autumn leaves, but the wind was not done with them. It stripped the silk from their bodies, shredding the finest brocades of the east into lint that vanished into the vortex. It stripped the flesh from their bones, desiccating the skin until it turned to leather and then to dust, leaving behind skeletons that were polished to a gleaming white by the abrasive sand. But even the skeletons were not allowed to remain. The dunes, moving like slow, golden waves, rolled over the field of death, burying the horses, the camels, and the riders under mountains of sand that rose 300 feet into the air. One by one, the bodies vanished from the light of the sun, encased in a tomb of silica, pressed down by the immense weight of the accumulating landscape. It was a mass grave of staggering proportions, yet there was no marker, no stone, no epitaph, only the shifting, restless surface of the desert that smoothed itself over the dead with the indifference of a butcher wiping a counter clean. In the center of this apocalypse lay Shaddad son of Ad, the man who would be king of worlds. He had not been torn apart like the others, his punishment was specific, a preservation of his shame. The wind had buried him upright, still mounted on his horse, encased in a tomb of compressed sand that hardened around him like a mold. Deep beneath the crushing weight of the new dunes, in the absolute darkness of the underground, Shaddad sat frozen in time, his mouth still open in that silent command, his hand still raised to block the sun that was no longer there. He was denied the dignity of decomposition, he was denied the mercy of returning to the cycle of nature. Instead, he was held in the grip of the earth, a fossil of arrogance, his dead eyes staring forever into the blackness of the crushed sand, waiting for a resurrection that would bring him not to a throne, but to a questioning. The jewels he had worn, the heavy crown of gold, the rings of power, were now chains that weighed him down, cold and heavy against his withered skin. He had wanted to live forever, he had wanted to be remembered forever, and in a terrifying twist of irony, Al-Malik granted him a form of immortality, the immortality of a warning, a preserved specimen of what happens when a creation challenges the creator. He was the king of nothing, the ruler of a suffocated empire, sitting on a dead horse in the crushing dark, while miles above his head, the wind finished its work of smoothing the surface until it looked as if no foot had ever trodden there since the dawn of time. By the 8th day, the wind began to die down, its fury spent, its mission accomplished. The howling scream faded into a low moan, and then into a whisper, and finally into the profound, heavy silence that characterizes the deep desert. The clouds that had blocked the sun for a week broke apart, dissolving into wisps of harmless vapor, and the sun, the true and impartial witness of history, returned to its place in the blue vault of the sky. It looked down upon the empty quarter, and it saw nothing. The city of Iram was gone. The towers were gone. The walls of silver and gold were gone. The army of 200,000 was gone. The vast caravan of wealth was gone. There was no ruin, no debris, no broken column jutting from the sand to mark the spot. There was only the endless, undulating ocean of gold and orange dunes, rippled by the breeze, pristine and untouched, stretching from horizon to horizon in a display of terrifying beauty. The landscape had been reset. The slate had been wiped clean. If a traveler were to walk across that spot 1 hour later, he would swear on his life that no city had ever stood there, that no king had ever marched there, that no human voice had ever broken the silence of the wastes. The erasure was so complete that it felt like a violence against memory itself. The very coordinates of the place were lost, scrambled by the shifting of the sands, so that even if the survivors of the tribe of Ad wanted to return to mourn, they would never find the grave. The name of the city became a myth, a whisper told around campfires by fearful nomads who claimed that on certain nights, when the moon is new and the wind blows from the north, one can smell the faint, rotting scent of musk rising from the ground, or hear the muffled tinkle of jewelry clinking together deep beneath the earth. But these are just stories, ghosts of a truth that was buried by the will of Al-Malik. The reality was far more stark. The land belonged to God, and when the tenant became too arrogant, the landlord simply evicted him and demolished the house, leaving not a single brick to tell the tale. The silence that settled over the Rub al-Khali after the destruction of Iram was not an empty silence, it was a heavy, pregnant silence, a silence that spoke louder than the scream of the wind. It was the silence of ownership. It was the desert asserting its dominance, breathing slowly and calmly once again, having digested the intruder who dared to disturb its peace. The particles of sand, which had been the tools of judgment, settled back into their slumber, holding in their microscopic spaces the secret of the golden city, hiding the wealth of nations and the bones of tyrants under a blanket of beautiful, deadly nothingness. The world moved on, the seasons turned, and the name of Shaddad became a synonym for folly, while the name of Al-Malik remained written in the constellations above, the only true king whose kingdom does not crumble, whose armies are the wind and the sound, and whose patience is the terrifying quiet before the storm. The stage was now empty, the actors removed, the set destroyed, leaving only the audience of the angels to bear witness to the truth that in the end, all kingdoms belong to the one who never sleeps, and all other kings are merely shadows waiting to be dispersed by the light of his morning. Centuries dissolved into millennia, and the wheel of time turned with a cruel and grinding indifference, crushing the memory of Shaddad and his golden folly into the fine powder of myth. The desert, that vast and silent graveyard, kept its secret well, folding the dunes over the corpse of the city like a mother pulling a blanket over a sleeping child, but this was a sleep from which there would be no waking. The trade routes shifted, the wells dried up, and the tribes that roamed the edges of the empty quarter spoke of the region not with curiosity, but with a bone-deep, superstitious dread, whispering around their campfires that the center of the sands was a place where the jinn wept and where the birds refused to fly. They called it a cursed coordinate, a blind spot on the map of creation where the anger of the heavens still lingered like the static charge after a lightning strike, making the hair on one's arms stand up and the heart palpitate with an inexplicable terror. For generations, no human foot dared to tread near the burial site of Ar-Rahman. The Bedouin, masters of the waste, would steer their camels miles off course to avoid the invisible boundary, claiming that the wind blowing from that direction carried the scent of burning sulfur and the muffled screams of men drowning in dry earth. The story of the City of Pillars became a nursery rhyme to frighten children, a cautionary tale about the man who tried to steal the sun and was swallowed by the dark, and eventually, even the rhyme faded, leaving only the name Ar-Rahman hanging in the air like a ghost word, devoid of meaning, a hollow echo of a forgotten sin. But the desert is a restless creature, and what it swallows, it sometimes regurgitates, not out of mercy, but out of a desire to remind the living of their own insignificance. It was in the 42nd year of the reign of the Caliph Muawiyah that the veil was momentarily lifted, a terrifying accident of fate that proved the legend was made of solid, horrifying matter. A lone man, a searcher of lost camels named Abdullah bin Kalaba, found himself driven by a freak sandstorm deep into the forbidden zone, deeper than any sane man had ventured in 1,000 years. Disoriented, his tongue swollen with thirst, his eyes stinging from the grit, he wandered through the shifting haze until the wind suddenly died, dropping the curtain of sand to reveal a sight that nearly stopped his heart. There, protruding from the side of a massive, wind-sheared dune like the bleached ribcage of a leviathan, was a section of the city that the earth had briefly exhaled. It was not a ruin in the traditional sense, there was no moss, no erosion of water, no sign of the slow decay of time. It was a pristine, preserved corpse of architecture. Abdullah saw a high wall of silver bricks that had turned black with age, and a gate of gold that still shimmered with a dull, malevolent luster under the harsh sun. He stood frozen, a speck of trembling flesh before the gates of the damned, his survival instinct screaming at him to run, but his awe pulling him forward like a moth to a killing flame. He stepped through the archway, his sandals crunching on a layer of petrified saffron, and entered the silence. It was a silence so heavy it felt like water filling his ears, a vacuum where sound simply could not exist. He walked down the streets that Shaddad had built for a procession that never happened, and he saw the madness of the design up close. He saw the balconies encrusted with rubies that were the size of ostrich eggs, now covered in a thin film of grey dust. He saw the rooms of the palaces with their doors hanging open, revealing furniture of ivory and ebony that had never been sat upon, waiting for ghosts that would never arrive. But what terrified him most was not the wealth, it was the atmosphere of arrested judgment. The air inside the city was cold, unnaturally cold, preserving a chill from the day of the Sarsar wind, a pocket of freezing temperature trapped in the furnace of the desert. He saw the dried beds of the rivers, the channels of onyx stained with the dark, sticky residue of the wine and honey that had once flowed there, now looking like dried blood in the veins of a dead beast. He saw the skeletons of the golden trees, bent and twisted, their jeweled leaves scattered on the ground like broken glass, glittering with a sharp, accusatory light. Abdullah reached out a trembling hand to touch a pillar of jasper, and the moment his skin made contact with the stone, he snatched it back with a gasp, for the stone did not feel like rock, it felt like ice, burning his fingertips with a cold that seemed to originate from the deepest circle of hell. He realized then that this was not a treasure house, it was a prison. It was a museum of vanity maintained by the angels of punishment. He looked down and saw, half buried in the dust, a small vessel made of a single hollowed-out pearl, a thing of priceless beauty that would have bought a kingdom in the world of men. Greed, that ancient enemy, whispered in his ear, and he bent down to pick it up. As he lifted the pearl, a sudden wind hissed through the empty streets, a sound like a sharp intake of breath, and the shadows of the tall towers seemed to lengthen and stretch toward him, grasping like long, dark fingers. Panic, primal and overwhelming, seized him. He dropped the pearl, which shattered into 1,000 pieces of worthless chalk upon hitting the ground, proof that the wealth of Iram was an illusion, forbidden to the sons of Adam. He turned and ran, his breath tearing at his throat, scrambling over the walls, sliding down the dunes, running until his legs gave out and his mind went blank, fleeing the crushing weight of the silent city. When he finally stumbled back into civilization, half mad and babbling, he was brought before the scholars and the rulers, and he poured out his story, swearing by the Almighty that he had seen the city of the pillars. They listened with faces pale with fear, for they knew the prophecies, and they knew that to find Iram was an omen of the end times. They sent scouts back to the location he described, men armed with maps and compasses, eager to confirm the discovery, but when they arrived at the coordinates, there was nothing. The desert had closed its mouth once again. The dune had shifted, the sand had filled the void, and the city had sunk back into the abyss, shielded by the will of Al-Malik from the curiosity of thieves. They found only the endless, rolling waves of orange sand, smooth and unbroken, mocking their efforts. The city was not lost, it was hidden, withheld, kept in a state of suspended animation until the day when the earth will quake and vomit forth its burdens. And so, the story ends not with a finding, but with a losing. The legacy of Shaddad is not a legacy of power, but of dust. Deep beneath the crushing pressure of the empty quarter, in the absolute, suffocating dark, the city still stands, preserved in its tomb of silica. The skeleton of Shaddad still sits upon his horse, his jaw hanging open in a silent scream, his eye sockets filled with sand, holding a court of corpses in a palace of darkness. He waits there, in the terrifying loneliness of his golden cage, not for a rescue, but for the second trumpet, for the day when the horn is blown and the physics of the universe are torn asunder. On that day, the sand will turn to vapor, the earth will crack open, and he will be raised from his suffocating grave to face the face of the one he mocked. He will look up and see that his gold has melted into lead, his silver has turned to fire, and his kingdom was nothing more than a fleeting shadow in the afternoon of a long day. The wind continues to blow over the Rub al-Khali, shifting the grains of sand one by one, erasing the footprints of travelers, erasing the lines of maps, erasing the pride of nations. It whispers the final truth to those who listen closely to the howling of the gale, that there is no king but Al-Malik, the owner of sovereignty. He gives the kingdom to whom he wills, and he tears the kingdom from whom he wills. He honors whom he wills, and he abases whom he wills. The tragedy of Iram is not that it was destroyed, but that it was forgotten, its existence reduced to a fable, its builder reduced to a warning. The traveler who stands at the edge of the desert today sees only beauty and emptiness, unaware that beneath his feet lies the greatest monument to human arrogance ever constructed, waiting in the dark for the moment when the mountains move like clouds and the true ownership of the cosmos is revealed. The story is a circle, closing on the terrified realization that we own nothing, not even the breath in our chests, and that in the end, everything we build, everything we hoard, and everything we are, will return to the dust from which it came, leaving only the face of the Lord of Majesty and honor to remain forever.